The ash heap was cold, a grey and bitter throne for a man who had once been the greatest in the East. Job sat amidst the cinders of his former life, his body a map of agony, covered in sores that burned like the memory of his lost children. The silence of the desert was not peaceful. It was heavy, a suffocating shroud that pressed against his chest with every ragged breath. Around him, the winds of the land of Uz whispered of everything he had lost. Thousands of livestock vanished in fire and steel, servants slaughtered, and the terrible crushing wind that had brought his home down upon his sons and daughters. He was a man stripped to the soul, left with nothing but the scratching of a broken piece of pottery against his skin and a heart that demanded a reason for the wreckage. Beside him sat his companions, three figures of shadows and stern theology. For days they had remained silent, but when they finally spoke, their words were colder than the desert night. They offered logic where Job needed mercy. They spoke of a God who was a cosmic accountant, weighing sins against sorrows, suggesting that Job's agony was merely the harvest of some hidden transgression. But Job knew the truth of his own integrity, and this knowledge made the darkness even more terrifying. If he was not being punished for a specific crime, then the universe was not a courtroom. It was a wilderness where monsters roamed unchecked. He looked into the obsidian expanse of the sky and saw not the stars, but the vast empty spaces between them. This was the psychological weight of unexplained suffering. It was a predator that had hunted him down and cornered him in the dust. To Job, the darkness was no longer just an absence of light, it was a living entity. He began to feel the presence of something ancient and terrible lurking beneath the surface of his reality. He did not yet name the beast of the deep, but he felt its scales scraping against the foundations of his faith. This was the shadow of the Leviathan, a symbol of the primordial chaos that seemed to be swallowing his world whole. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The central conflict burned brighter than his fever. If the Creator was indeed good, why did such a monster of suffering exist? Why was there a place in the divine design for the king over all the sons of pride to tear through the lives of the innocent? Job's voice, cracked and weary, rose against the night air, demanding an audience. He did not want a lecture on morality from his friends. He wanted a face-to-face confrontation with the Almighty. He wanted to know why the boundaries between order and chaos had been breached, and why he, a mere man of flesh and bone, was being crushed by forces that belonged to the abyss. The atmosphere shifted. The oppressive stillness of the desert night began to tremble. A low hum, like the vibration of 1,000 distant drums, rose from the horizon. The sand began to dance, leaping in small, frantic circles around the ash heap. The logic of his friends fell silent as the sky itself seemed to bruise, turning a deep, violent purple. A whirlwind was forming, not of dust and wind alone, but of presence and power. The weight of the atmosphere became unbearable, and the mighty who might have stood tall in battle would have found their knees hitting the earth in primal fear. Suddenly, the air was ripped apart. The whirlwind arrived not as a gentle breeze of comfort, but as a storm that threatened to dissolve the very ground Job sat upon. Out of the heart of the tempest, a voice emerged, not a human whisper, but a sound that resonated in the marrow of his bones. It was the first booming question from the heavens, a roar that silenced the complaints of the man and the cold logic of his friends. The Creator had arrived, not to offer an apology, but to unveil the terrifying majesty of a world where the Leviathan still breathed. The storm had just begun. The voice from the whirlwind did not offer the soft comfort Job expected. It offered a vision of staggering power. The Creator began to sketch an anatomical nightmare, a creature so formidable that the mere sight of it would cast a man down. God spoke of the Leviathan's scales, describing them as rows of shields tightly sealed. They were so fused that not even a breath of air could pass between them, an organic armor that rendered the beast impenetrable to the spears of men. This was not a creature of soft flesh, it was a living fortress of bone. Job, once certain of his importance, now listened as the heavens described eyes that flickered like the golden rays of the morning, glowing with a predatory light that signaled the very foundations of a terror he could not hope to escape. Many wonder if this narrative pointed to a relic of a prehistoric world. In the halls of cryptozoology, the dinosaur theory suggests that Job was looking upon a Kronosaurus or a Plesiosaur, monsters of the deep that survived the great upheavals of the past. These were creatures with jaws capable of snapping timber like dry straw. To the ancient mind, such a beast would be a living chronicle of a world that existed before man, a remnant of a time when the earth was raw and violent. The description of its massive limbs and crushing power matches the mysterious fossilized evidence of these apex predators, leading many to argue that the Leviathan was a biological reality, a dinosaur that swam alongside the early patriarchs. Yet, the naturalist theory attempts to tether this vision to the known world, pointing to the dangerous Nile crocodile. There are similarities, the thick hide and terrifying teeth. But as the divine description continues, the crocodile shrinks in comparison to the beast of the whirlwind. Could a crocodile truly make the deep sea boil? Could a mere reptile breathe out smoke like a seething pot? The text speaks of hissing sparks of fire leaping from its mouth and a breath that kindles coals. This detail pushes the Leviathan out of simple zoology and into the mythic. It suggests a creature that blurs the line between the physical and the supernatural, a biological entity that somehow channels the elemental forces of destruction. Job sat in the dust, his mind reeling as the Creator shifted the focus to the beast's psychological effect on the world. This creature was a bringer of primal, paralyzing dread. When the Leviathan raises itself, even the mighty are afraid. These were the world's bravest warriors, the elite who had survived 1,000 storms, yet they fled in panic at the mere splashing of the beast. They were men who wore iron and bronze, yet they were broken by a creature that regarded iron as straw. The arrow could not make it flee, and slingstones were turned to stubble against its hide. It laughed at the shaking of a spear, mocking the tools man used to assert dominance over the natural world. In this moment, the spiritual crisis Job faced was mirrored by a biological impossibility. Why would God describe a monster to a man already devoured by the monster of grief? The tension became a heavy weight. By revealing the Leviathan, the Creator forced Job to confront a terrifying truth. The universe held things wild and beyond his control. The mighty beast was a sovereign of the abyss, acknowledging no master and fearing no hunter. It was the king over all the sons of pride, a mirror to the arrogance that led Job to believe he could understand the divine. This creature could not be bargained with, nor could it be tamed by any human hand. As the description reached its crescendo, a chilling realization settled over the ash heap. If the bravest could not stand before the creature, then who could possibly restrain such a force? If man cannot control the beast, who holds its leash? The darkness was no longer an empty void, but a hidden kingdom where the Creator's most terrible subject reigned supreme. And Job was left to wonder if the chaos in his own life was as purposeful as the fire in the beast's eyes. The echoes of the desert night were not merely filled with the wind. They carried the weight of ancient whispers from every corner of the fertile crescent. When the Creator spoke of the Leviathan, he was tapping into a collective nightmare that had haunted the human psyche long before Job sat upon his ash heap. In the Ugaritic tablets of the Canaanites, there was Lotan, the seven-headed serpent of the sea, a writhing shadow of destruction. In the smoky chambers of Babylon, the priests spoke of Tiamat, the draconic personification of the saltwater abyss. God was not presenting a simple biology lesson. He was speaking the language of anti-creation, using a symbol that resonated with the primal fears of a world that felt the constant pressure of the unknown. To the ancient mind, the sea was the ultimate boundary, a tehom or deep that remained forever restless and hostile to the order of man. It was a place of perpetual death and disorder where the light of the sun reached its limit and died. For Job, the ocean was not a scenic vista, but a churning graveyard that swallowed ships and civilizations without leaving a trace. It represented the parts of existence that refused to submit to human law. When the voice from the whirlwind described the Leviathan making the deep sea boil, it was evoking the primal dread of everything that remains unfinished. This was the roar of the void itself, reminding Job that the world was far older and more dangerous than his prosperity. As the storm raged, a profound realization began to settle into the marrow of Job's bones. His suffering was no longer a series of disconnected tragedies or a mechanical failure of divine justice. He began to see that he was standing at the epicenter of a cosmic struggle. He wasn't just grieving the loss of his wealth. He was facing a force that preceded the foundations of the world. The chaos he felt in his soul, the overwhelming grief that felt like a drowning tide, now had a name. It was the Leviathan within, a creature of primordial darkness that defied the sunlight of his former life. Job realized he wasn't just fighting bad luck, he was facing the personification of chaos that he could not name. The theological weight of this revelation felt like a subtle, divine betrayal. Job had lived under the assumption of a neat universe where the righteous were protected. But now, the Almighty was not apologizing for the monster. He was describing its invincibility with terrifying pride. Job had to confront the most uncomfortable question: does the Creator allow chaos to roam free in his world? If God is the architect of all things, then he is the architect of the abyss as well. He is the one who granted the serpent its fire and the sea its depth, weaving the thread of the monster into the tapestry of existence. This suggested that the universe was far more complex and dangerous than Job's rigid theology could ever accommodate. The Leviathan was not an accident. It was a deliberate inhabitant of the divine ecosystem. This meant that the chaos in Job's life, the inexplicable destruction of his world, was not outside of God's purview. It was part of a landscape where the monstrous and the beautiful occupied the same space. Job looked into the spiritual mirror of the whirlwind and saw a reflection he did not recognize. The beast, the king over all the sons of pride, began to look like a mirror of Job's own internal storm. Was he not, in his demand for an explanation, showing the very pride that the monster personified? The beast was a spiritual reality that dwelt in the heart, waiting for moments of brokenness to claim its kingdom. Job realized he was helpless against a cosmic force of darkness without divine intervention. The revelation was not a comfort, it was a terrifying expansion of the battlefield, suggesting that the monster was a spiritual mirror of his own internal storm. Job gasped as the weight of this truth crushed the last remnants of his former certainty. He was no longer just a man mourning his losses. He was a soul staring directly into the dark eyes of mystery. The whirlwind's roar intensified, pulling Job's gaze away from the dust and toward the spiritual horizon. The Creator's description of the Leviathan began to bleed into a larger tapestry of cosmic conflict. In the scrolls of the prophets, this beast was no mere dweller of the deep. It was the piercing serpent, the crooked dragon, that Isaiah later described as the target of divine vengeance. In the ancient hymns of the Psalms, the Leviathan was a multi-headed terror whose defeat signaled the victory of order over chaos. Job began to see that the monster before him was a shadow of a spiritual reality that spanned the entire history of the world. It was a dragon that existed before human memory and would remain until the end of days. The shift from biology to demonology was devastating. When the voice from the storm declared the Leviathan the king over all the sons of pride, the words pierced Job deeper than any physical ailment. This was the spiritual anatomy of the beast, the embodiment of the ego that refuses to bow, seeking to elevate itself above the throne of the Almighty. Job looked at his own heart and saw reflections of that same pride. He had demanded an audience and insisted on his own righteousness as if it were a shield. In doing so, he had unwittingly invited the spirit of the Leviathan to sit at his side. The monster was the atmosphere of every soul that dared to stand as its own judge. This serpent was not a passive observer of human suffering. It was a predator characterized by a relentless and cold vengeance. It did not seek to destroy Job because he had sinned, but because he was the target of God's favor. The chaos of the Leviathan was a hunger that sought to devour the righteous man without cause, turning his world into a wasteland. This was anti-creation in its purest form, the undoing of light and the mockery of joy. Job realized that his loss of children and his decaying skin were not just bad luck. They were the bite marks of a cosmic dragon. The serpent was a specialist in desolation, and Job had become its primary prey in the barren desert. Yet the most haunting realization was the nature of the beast's existence. Why did the Creator allow such a thing to dwell within his kingdom? The mystery of evil loomed larger than the storm. God did not speak of the Leviathan as an escaped convict or an error in the blueprint of the universe. Instead, he spoke of it as a creature under his sovereign authority. It was a beast kept on a leash, a monster that could only roam as far as the divine hand allowed. The Creator was its master. This brought a sharper terror to Job's heart. If God could destroy the dragon yet chose to let it live, then the logic of the universe was far more mysterious than any cold theology. Job's fear began to undergo a transformation into a bone-deep awe of the holy. He saw that he was a tiny participant in a spiritual war of unimaginable proportions. The scale of the spiritual world was being revealed in layers of lightning. He looked at the whirlwind and realized that the monsters he had feared were merely pawns in a much larger game. The physical world was but a thin veil over a churning sea of spiritual powers. Job felt himself shrinking as he witnessed the terrifying grandeur of a God who ruled over the most horrific things imaginable. The thought was paralyzing. Man is completely helpless in the face of such darkness without divine intervention. Job had tried to defend himself with arguments, but against the king of pride, those weapons were useless. He stood on the ash heap, a broken man, realizing his only hope was the mercy of the one who held the chain of the beast. Without protection, the darkness would consume. The spiritual mirror of the Leviathan had shown Job the limits of his soul, leaving him to wait for the storm's next word, knowing that if the Creator turned his back for even a moment, the serpent would rise from the depths to claim what was left of his life. The whirlwind did not relent. Instead, the intensity of the divine voice surged, vibrating through the very marrow of Job's bones. The Creator was no longer just describing the beast. He was posing a series of questions that dripped with a terrifying, holy irony. "Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook?" The voice boomed, the sound echoing off the desolate mountains. "Can you tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook?" These were not mere inquiries about Job's hunting skills. They were a surgical strike against the core of his human pride. Job felt the sting of his insignificance as the divine voice continued to peel back the layers of his self-righteousness. Every question was a reminder that the world did not revolve around his understanding of fairness. Job, who had spent months constructing a legal case against the Almighty, was now faced with the reality of his own utter helplessness before a single creature of the deep. The irony was devastating. Job had presumed to understand the complex gears of universal justice, yet he could not even hope to manage a wild animal that God had spoken into existence. The contrast was stark and humbling. Here was a man who had lost everything, his wealth, his health, and his family, and had demanded to know why the universe had turned against him. He had sought a logical explanation, a ledger of sins and punishments that would make sense of his agony. But God's response was not a lecture on morality or a defense of his actions. It was a demonstration of absolute sovereignty. By challenging Job to tame the untamable, God was revealing the absurdity of the creature judging the Creator. The Leviathan was not just a beast in the water. It was the boundary line where human logic failed and divine wisdom began. If Job could not stand before the Leviathan without trembling, if he could not command the waves or the monsters that inhabited them, by what authority did he demand to cross-examine the master of the abyss? This humiliation was a necessary awakening, forcing Job to see a universe he had tried to reduce to simple rules. The silence of Job's friends was deafening in the wake of the whirlwind's roar. They had offered cold logic and rigid theology, trying to fit Job's suffering into a small, predictable box. But the Creator was shattering that box, replacing it with a vision of a world that was wild, dangerous, and governed by a wisdom far beyond human comprehension. Job realized that his immense suffering was not the center of the cosmos. He was witnessing a divine drama involving creatures that served purposes known only to the sovereign architect of light. The focus was shifting. Job was no longer looking at his own sores or the ashes at his feet. His eyes were being pulled upward and outward toward the terrifying beauty of a God who ruled over the most chaotic forces of existence with a calm and effortless hand. The why of Job's pain remained unanswered in the traditional sense. God did not apologize for the loss of Job's children or the destruction of his estates. Instead, he showed Job who he was. This was the ultimate restoration of perspective. To see God as the master of the dragon was to see him as the master of the storm. The victim was being transformed into a witness of majesty. Job's role in the story was evolving from a man enduring a trial to a man beholding a mystery. The terror of the Leviathan was being recontextualized as a testament to the Creator's power. If the beast was invincible to man, it was merely a pet to God. This revelation changed everything Job thought he knew about power and control. The revelation was a hammer blow to Job's perceived self-importance. God revealed his relationship with the monster, a revelation that changed everything Job thought he knew about power. This was not a contest between two equals. It was the playful dominion of a king over his creation. The hook was held by the hand that had once sustained Job, proving that even the most terrifying things are under divine control. The whirlwind continued to pulse with the rhythmic intensity of a cosmic heartbeat. As the divine voice rolled over the desert dunes, a shocking revelation began to take shape in Job's mind, overturning centuries of human fear. For generations, the name of the Leviathan had been whispered with dread, seen as a rogue force of destruction seeking to undo the works of light. But the Creator's tone changed. He did not speak of the serpent as a foe to be vanquished in a desperate struggle, but as a masterpiece of his own hand. The terrifying beast, with its scales like shields and its breath like burning coals, was not God's enemy, it was his creature. In the grand tapestry of existence, the Leviathan was described almost as a plaything, a marvel that the Almighty had formed to frolic in the deep. This was the theological breakthrough that shattered Job's remaining defenses. If the very embodiment of chaos and terror was part of God's complex ecosystem, then the universe was far more intricate than Job had ever imagined. He had looked at the monster and seen only a threat to life, a mindless engine of despair. But through the whirlwind's lens, Job saw that God was so infinitely powerful that the thing that terrified man was merely a detail in a much larger divine design. The Leviathan was not an accident. It was not a sign that the Creator had lost control. Instead, it was a testament to a sovereignty so absolute that even the anti-creation, the raw, wild power of the abyss, served a purpose in the hand of the architect. The redemption of the narrative was beginning to take root in the soil of Job's suffering. If God governed the Leviathan, if he could place a hook in its nose and lead it like a domesticated ox, then he surely governed the chaos that had ravaged Job's life. The boils on his skin and the empty chairs at his table were no longer evidence of God's absence. Rather, they were part of a beautiful terror. Job began to understand that God's wisdom included things that are dangerous and seemingly cruel to the human eye, but which are held within a perfect, sovereign balance. The universe was not just safe and nice. It was a vast and terrifying kingdom, where the Leviathan had its place under the watch of a king, who did not need to explain himself to his subjects. A profound silence settled over the ash heap, a silence that originated within Job himself. The man who had spent months demanding a day in court, who had filled the desert air with eloquent defenses and bitter lamentations, finally reached the limit of his words. As the majesty of the Creator's world was unveiled, Job realized that his previous speeches were like the babbling of a child trying to describe the mechanics of the stars. He saw the foolishness of his own arrogance. He had tried to judge the moral order of the cosmos from the perspective of a single, wounded life, never realizing that he was part of a story that spanned dimensions he couldn't even name. With a trembling hand, Job placed his palm over his mouth. He realized that his words were, without knowledge, mere echoes in a canyon compared to the roar of the divine presence. His perspective had shifted from the horizontal to the vertical. He was no longer looking at the injustice of his situation, but at the grandeur of the situator. The monster of his pain hadn't vanished, but it had been dwarfed by the master of the abyss. This was the moment of total surrender, a surrender born not of defeat, but of overwhelming awe. The crushing weight of the Leviathan's image had been replaced by the weight of God's glory. In this sacred stillness, the monster ceased to be a threat that could destroy Job's faith. Instead, it became a testament to God's control. Job stood amidst the ruins of his life, yet for the first time he felt a strange, terrifying peace. The chaos was real, but it was controlled. The beast was wild, but it was caged by the word of the one who now spoke from the heart of the storm. As the whirlwind began to dissipate, leaving only the soft whistle of the desert wind and settling dust, the world felt strangely new. Job remained on his knees, his hands pressed against the parched earth he had once cursed in his agony. The boils on his skin were still there. The ashes still clung to his robes, but the fire of his resentment had been extinguished by a far greater flame. He had looked into the eyes of the Leviathan and seen the reflection of the Creator's untamable majesty. He understood now that restoration did not mean the profound erasure of history. The aftermath of the vision brought a physical return to life, yet Job was forever marked. The scriptures tell us that the Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the first. Thousands of sheep, camels and oxen once again filled his horizon, and the voices of new children echoed through his halls. Yet, this was not a simple, happy ending, where the trauma was discarded like an old garment. Job carried the scars of his trial as sacred markers of his journey into the deep. When he looked at his restored wealth, he saw it through the lens of a man who had stood at the very edge of the abyss and survived by the grace of the architect. Every joy was now tempered by a profound, holy reverence. He knew that the things he possessed were not his own by right, but gifts held in the Almighty's hand. The story of Job and the Leviathan is not a dusty relic. It is a living mirror for every human soul facing a modern storm. In our contemporary world, the Leviathan takes on many different, equally terrifying forms. It is the crushing weight of a clinical depression that feels like a beast with scales of iron, impervious to the well-meaning advice of friends. It is the sudden, catastrophic loss of a career, the medical diagnosis that shatters a family's future, or the hollow, persistent ache of a grief that seems to breathe fire into the night. We often cry out in the darkness as Job did, demanding that the Creator remove the monster from our lives immediately. We crave a world that is safe, predictable, and devoid of the terrifying deep. But the message of the whirlwind is a radical shift. Peace is found in the presence of the Master. This is the ultimate spiritual metaphor of controlled chaos. To trust the Creator is to accept that He is the master of the sea dragon. It is the realization that if He can put a hook in the nose of the primordial serpent, He can surely manage the chaos currently swirling in your heart. We find hope not by pretending the danger doesn't exist, but by realizing that the leash of every monster is held by a hand that is both infinitely powerful and purposefully just. The Leviathan is real, its teeth are sharp, and its power is immense, yet it remains a creature of the deep, a plaything in the eyes of the Almighty. When we grasp this, the monster ceases to be an indicator of God's abandonment. Instead, it becomes a testament to His terrifyingly beautiful sovereignty, showing that the world is not a manageable, small, rigid box. Why do we need these terrible parts of creation to understand grace? Perhaps because a God who only manages the pleasant, safe things is not a God strong enough to rescue us from the actual abyss. We need the master of the Leviathan. We need the Creator who is comfortable in the whirlwind and sovereign over the dragon, because only such a God can offer a peace that truly surpasses human understanding. If God is the master of the sea dragon, He is undeniably the master of your storm. Job lived many years after his encounter, seeing his descendants to the 4th generation. But it was not longevity that defined his legacy. It was the silence on the ash heap. He learned that to truly know God is to respect the wildness of His wisdom. The darkness is no longer fear. It is the domain of a king who knows where the hook is placed. The beast was never the end of story.